I spent 3 years and my life savings getting him back on his feet after his breakdown. Last week, he told his new therapist I was just someone convenient who happened to be around when he needed help. I heard it through the thin walls of the coffee shop where he was having his session over video call. David, sitting 2 tables away, completely unaware I was there, described our entire relationship to his therapist as if I were some random bystander who stumbled into his life during a difficult period, not the person who sacrificed everything to keep him alive, not the friend who chose his healing over her own financial future, just someone convenient. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. 3 years ago, David was dying. Not literally, though there were moments I worried about that too, but dying in every way that mattered, professionally, emotionally, spiritually. I watched it happen in real time during what should have been a routine coffee meeting between old college friends. We had reconnected 6 months earlier through social media, the way people do when algorithms remind them of shared history. David had reached out first, commenting on a photo from my promotion celebration with something about being proud of me. I remembered him as brilliant but scattered, the kind of person who could solve complex problems but forgot to eat meals. We started texting occasionally, then meeting for coffee every few weeks when our schedules aligned. That October afternoon, I was running late to meet him at our usual cafe downtown. Work had been brutal, back-to-back client meetings that ran over, emails piling up faster than I could address them. I almost canceled, but something about his text from that morning stuck with me. He really needed to see a friendly face today, not his usual casual tone. I found him sitting in the corner booth, staring into a cup of coffee that had obviously gone cold hours ago. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was unwashed, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a tremor in his hands that I initially attributed to too much caffeine. When I apologized for being late and mentioned my chaotic day, he looked up at me with eyes that were completely hollow. Not sad, not angry, just empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him David. He had lost his job 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks of sitting on this devastating news, dealing with it alone. The words came out quietly, matter-of-factly, as if he were commenting on the weather. Performance issues, they said, attendance problems, difficulty meeting deadlines. He acknowledged they weren't wrong. He had been struggling. Struggling, such a small word for what I was witnessing. His hands shook as he lifted the cold coffee to his lips, then set it down without drinking. His leg bounced under the table with nervous energy. Most telling of all, he couldn't seem to maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. The timeline became clearer as he explained. Everything had started falling apart since Sarah left. Maybe before that, it was hard for him to tell anymore. Sarah, his girlfriend of 4 years. I remembered him mentioning they'd broken up, but he'd been vague about the details, and I hadn't pushed. Now I was seeing the aftermath of what must have been a complete life implosion. His living situation was equally precarious. His lease had been up the previous month. He'd been planning to move in with Sarah, but that obviously hadn't happened. Now he was crashing on his cousin Marcus's couch, a temporary arrangement that felt increasingly unstable. The picture was becoming clearer. Job loss, relationship end, housing instability. The trifecta of life disruption that could break anyone, but seemed to be absolutely destroying David. When I asked about professional help, he shook his head with a defeated expression. He couldn't afford therapy, no insurance anymore, obviously. And even when he had insurance, finding someone who took it, who had openings, who actually helped, the whole system felt impossibly complex when you were barely functioning. Maybe he just wasn't fixable. Something in the way he said that last part made my chest tight. This wasn't just sadness or temporary setback. This was someone who had lost hope entirely. I had been David's friend for less than a year of reconnection, but I remembered the person he used to be. Quick-witted, passionate about his work in software development, always full of ideas and projects. The person sitting across from me was a shell of that man. My first instinct was to offer research help, finding therapists in the area, making calls, exploring sliding scale fees, but he shut down that avenue immediately. He was living on what remained of his savings, which wasn't much. Marcus was letting him stay for free, but he couldn't even contribute to groceries. He felt like such a burden on everyone. The word burden hit me strangely, maybe because I recognized something of myself in it, the fear of taking up too much space, of needing too much from others, or maybe because I could see how completely he believed it about himself. I found myself contradicting him firmly. He wasn't a burden, he was going through a crisis. That's what friends were for. When he looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down, there was something desperate in his expression, like a drowning person who just spotted a lifeline. He admitted that he didn't have many friends left. Most people had gotten tired of the drama pretty quickly. Sarah had taken a lot of their mutual friends with her when she left. He couldn't blame them, really. He hadn't been much fun to be around lately. I felt something shift inside me, some combination of compassion and determination. Here was someone who had been important to me once, who was clearly drowning, and everyone else had walked away. Maybe I couldn't fix his life, but I could throw him a rope. The offer to stay with me came out before I'd fully thought it through. I had a spare bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was private, and he wouldn't have to worry about overstaying his welcome or imposing on family. David stared at me like I'd just offered him $1,000,000. He couldn't ask me to do that, but I wasn't asking, I was offering. I warmed to the idea even as I spoke about it. He could take time to get back on his feet, figure out his next steps. Maybe we could research therapists together, find someone who worked with his situation. When he mentioned not having money for rent or therapy or much of anything, I brushed those concerns aside. We would figure it out. The important thing was getting him stable and getting him help. The rest we could work out later. For the first time since I'd arrived, David's face showed something other than despair. Not happiness exactly, but relief, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally exhale. He asked if I was sure, worried about messing up my life too. I assured him he wouldn't. What would mess up my life was knowing I could have helped a friend and choosing not to. We spent the next hour working out logistics. He could move in the following weekend. I would help him research mental health resources in the meantime. He would contribute to household expenses when he was able, but there was no pressure while he was getting back on his feet. It felt good to have a plan, to be doing something concrete to help. I had a good job, money in savings, a comfortable life with room to spare. David had been ground down to nothing by circumstances that could happen to anyone. Helping him seemed not just kind, but obvious. I drove home that evening feeling lighter than I had in months. Work stress, dating disappointments, the general anxiety of 30-something life, it all felt manageable when put up against David's crisis. I had purpose now, a way to make a real difference in someone's life. That night I cleared out my spare bedroom, which had been serving as a catch-all for storage and exercise equipment I rarely used. I made space in the closet, set up the bed with fresh linens, even bought some basic toiletries and snacks to stock the bathroom and kitchen. I wanted David to feel welcome, to know that someone cared about his well-being. When I called my sister Emma to tell her about the arrangement, her response was immediate skepticism. I barely knew this guy. We had reconnected 6 months ago, and now I was moving him into my home. Her questions came rapid fire. Where was his family, other friends, his ex-girlfriend? I found myself getting defensive, which surprised me. His family lived across the country, and he didn't have other friends right now. His ex-girlfriend was part of the problem. I had the space and the resources. He needed help. It was temporary. When Emma asked how temporary, I realized I didn't have a good answer. A few months, maybe. However long it took for him to get back on his feet. Emma urged caution, warned me about setting myself up to be taken advantage of. I dismissed her concerns. David wasn't like that. He was just someone who needed help right now. After we hung up, I pushed Emma's worries out of my mind. She didn't understand the situation, hadn't seen the desperation in David's eyes. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts about people, and my instincts said David was worth helping. The move-in went smoothly. David arrived with everything he owned fitting into 2 suitcases and a backpack. He was quiet, almost apologetic about taking up space, constantly expressing gratitude for my generosity. He kept his belongings neatly contained to his room and one corner of the bathroom. He bought his own food with what little money he had, ate meals quietly, and spent most of his time either looking for jobs online or sleeping. For the first few weeks, the arrangement felt sustainable, even positive. David was a considerate housemate, clean, quiet, respectful of my space and schedule. Having someone else in the apartment made it feel more alive, less lonely after long days at work. I enjoyed having someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who appreciated small gestures like cooking dinner or picking up his favorite coffee. More importantly, I felt like I was making a difference. David seemed a little less hollow each day, a little more present in conversations. He was applying for jobs, slowly rebuilding his routine, talking about future plans instead of just surviving the present. 3 weeks after he moved in, I brought up the topic of therapy again. I had been researching therapists who offered sliding scale fees and found quite a few options in the area. David's response was uncomfortable resistance. He appreciated my research, but he still wasn't in a position to pay for therapy. Even sliding scale fees were probably more than he could manage right now. I had been expecting this response and had already decided how to handle it. I offered to cover the cost initially, just until he was working again and could take over the payments. David stared at me with disbelief. He couldn't let me do that. I was already giving him free housing. He couldn't take my money too. I reframed it as investment rather than charity. investment in his health, his future. I had savings and he needed help. When he was back on his feet, he could pay me back if he wanted to, but right now, this was what made sense. I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, pride warring with desperation, independence fighting against need. He asked if I was sure, acknowledging that therapy wasn't cheap, even with sliding scale. It could be a significant amount over time. I was sure this was what savings were for: emergencies, helping people you cared about, making investments in things that mattered. David's mental health mattered. The next week, I wrote the first check to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist who specialized in depression and life transitions. $150 for a 50-minute session. David cried when I handed him the receipt, not from sadness but from relief. He expressed overwhelming gratitude, admitting he didn't know how to thank me, that simple words weren't enough for what I was doing. I told him he didn't need to thank me, just to focus on getting better. That was all the thanks I needed. Looking back now, I can see that moment as the beginning of everything that followed. The first time I normalized spending my money on David's needs. The first time I positioned myself as his financial lifeline. The first time I made his healing my responsibility. But at the time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I had resources, he had needs, and combining them seemed like simple math. I couldn't have imagined then how quickly that math would become unsustainable, how easily generosity could become exploitation, how thoroughly someone could take everything you offered and then rewrite history to erase your sacrifice entirely. I just knew that my friend was hurting and I had the power to help him heal. The fact that it would cost me everything never occurred to me then. I thought I was saving him. I had no idea I was drowning myself. 6 months into David's stay, I was sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, calculator in hand, trying to understand how my savings account had dropped by $8,000. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't make sense either. Therapy sessions, medication costs, groceries, utilities, the occasional emergency expense. Somehow it all added up to more than I had anticipated, more than seemed possible for someone who was supposedly getting back on his feet. The therapy sessions alone were eating through my budget faster than I had calculated. Dr. Martinez had recommended twice-weekly sessions initially, which meant $300 a week. David's depression had layers, she explained during the one session I attended with him. Childhood trauma, relationship patterns, career anxiety. They would need time to unpack it all properly. When David relayed this information to me with such hope in his eyes, such genuine belief that he was finally getting the help he needed, I couldn't bring myself to suggest we scale back. Then came the medication. David's primary care physician, another expense I was covering since he had no insurance, prescribed an antidepressant that cost $240 per month without coverage. When the first prescription didn't work after 6 weeks, they tried another one, same price. The third medication required careful monitoring, which meant additional doctor visits at $120 each. I found myself becoming intimately familiar with the cash pay rates of the entire local healthcare system. Blood work to monitor medication levels, a sleep study when David complained of insomnia, a consultation with a psychiatrist when his primary care doctor wanted a specialist's opinion on his medication regimen. Each appointment generated new recommendations, new expenses, new reasons why his healing couldn't be rushed or compromised by financial constraints. David's gratitude during this period was overwhelming and constant. He thanked me multiple times daily for enabling his treatment, for believing in his recovery, for not giving up on him when everyone else had. He showed me articles about the importance of proper mental health care, statistics about untreated depression, testimonials from people whose lives had been saved by finding the right therapist and medication combination. He was building a case for why every dollar I spent was justified, necessary, potentially life-saving. The job search, meanwhile, had become a source of constant discussion and mounting frustration. David applied for positions daily, he assured me, but the market was competitive. His mental health struggles had created a gap in his employment history that was difficult to explain in interviews. Potential employers could sense his anxiety, his lack of confidence. Dr. Martinez had suggested he might not be ready for full-time employment, yet anyway, the stress could trigger a relapse, undo all the progress they were making in therapy. This logic felt circular but convincing. David couldn't work because he was too unstable, but he couldn't become stable without expensive treatment, but the treatment took time to work, during which he couldn't contribute financially. Meanwhile, I was not only covering all his expenses, but also missing work myself to drive him to appointments, manage his crises, and provide the emotional support Dr. Martinez said was crucial during this phase of his recovery. My own job performance began to suffer in ways that should have alarmed me more than they did. I was arriving late after dropping David off for morning therapy sessions, leaving early to pick him up when he felt too anxious to take public transportation, taking long lunch breaks to handle his insurance paperwork or research new treatment options, working from home on days when his anxiety was particularly severe and he needed someone present. My manager, Janet, started making comments about my availability and focus. Nothing directly confrontational yet, just observations about missed deadlines and postponed client meetings. I found myself lying about the reasons, family emergencies, personal health issues, anything that sounded more legitimate than supporting my unemployed housemate's mental health treatment. The financial strain started manifesting in small ways at first. I stopped eating lunch out, brown bagging it instead to save $15 a day. I canceled my gym membership, reasoning that I was too busy to use it anyway. I postponed the vacation I had planned for my birthday, telling friends I was too swamped with work to take time off. But the larger expenses were harder to absorb invisibly. When David's antidepressant stopped working and Dr. Martinez recommended a more expensive alternative that required genetic testing to ensure compatibility, I put the $400 test on my credit card. When David had a panic attack severe enough to warrant an emergency room visit, the $1,200 bill went on the same card. When Dr. Martinez suggested adding a trauma specialist to his treatment team for EMDR therapy, I researched practitioners and wrote another first-session check. David's awareness of these mounting costs seemed to exist in a strange bubble of acknowledgement without action. He would apologize profusely when I mentioned a new expense, express guilt about being such a burden, and promise to pay me back as soon as he was working again. But these conversations never led to any concrete changes in his treatment plan or lifestyle. If anything, they seemed to increase his anxiety, which Dr. Martinez said could impede his progress, which justified continuing the expensive treatment regimen. The guilt manipulation was so subtle I didn't recognize it as manipulation at all. David never directly asked for money or demanded that I cover his expenses. Instead, he would share his fears about what would happen if he couldn't afford therapy, his terror of sliding back into the depression that had nearly destroyed him, his gratitude for having someone who understood the importance of proper mental health care. He painted scenarios where scaling back treatment would be catastrophic, where my financial support was literally keeping him alive. I believed these scenarios because I wanted to believe them, because believing them meant my sacrifice had meaning, that I was genuinely helping someone heal rather than just enabling dependency. Because admitting that David might be manipulating my compassion would have meant acknowledging how much I had already lost for potentially nothing. 8 months in, I had to take out a personal loan to cover my own rent. David's expenses had consumed not just my monthly surplus, but had started eating into my emergency fund and then my regular savings. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was borrowing money to pay for my own housing while providing free housing to someone else. But David was finally making progress in therapy, Dr. Martinez reported. He was more stable, more self-aware, better equipped to handle stress. It would be tragic to disrupt his treatment now, when he was so close to being ready for independence. The definition of close to ready remained frustratingly vague. David had started applying for jobs more seriously, he said, but the interview process was triggering his anxiety. Dr. Martinez suggested he might benefit from some career counseling to rebuild his professional confidence, another specialist at another hourly rate. David worried that jumping into full-time work too quickly might overwhelm his still fragile mental state. Maybe he should start with part-time work or consulting or volunteer opportunities to ease back into professional life. Each conversation about his timeline pushed his independence further into the future while the costs continued mounting in the present. I found myself working overtime whenever possible to increase my income, but the extra hours made me more tired and stressed, which made me less able to provide the emotional support David needed, which increased his anxiety and need for additional therapy sessions. My social life had essentially disappeared. I couldn't afford to go out with friends anymore, and even when they offered to pay, I was usually too exhausted or needed to be available for David. He had started having anxiety attacks in the evenings, particularly on weekends when his routine was disrupted. Dr. Martinez explained that consistency and support were crucial during this phase of treatment. My presence helped ground him, reminded him that he wasn't alone in his struggle. The few times I tried to maintain my own friendships or interests, David's distress was palpable. Not manipulative exactly, but genuinely anxious about being left alone with his thoughts. He would apologize repeatedly for needing so much support, which only made me feel guilty for wanting any independence. I started declining invitations automatically, telling myself it was temporary, that once David was stable, I could rebuild my social connections. My sister Emma's concern had evolved into alarm by this point. During our monthly phone calls, she would ask pointed questions about timelines and boundaries that I found myself unable to answer clearly. When was David planning to move out? What was his job search timeline? How much of my savings had I spent on his treatment? Was I planning to support him indefinitely? I didn't have good answers to any of these questions because David and I had never established clear expectations or deadlines. Every conversation about his future was clouded by discussions of his mental health needs, the importance of not rushing his recovery, the potential consequences of adding financial pressure to his healing process. It felt cruel to set arbitrary deadlines for someone's psychological wellness, heartless to put monetary limits on potentially life-saving treatment. But the numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. $12,000 from my savings account, $4,000 in credit card debt, a personal loan with monthly payments that stretched my budget to its absolute limits. I was living paycheck to paycheck while funding someone else's comprehensive mental health care, and there was still no clear endpoint in sight. The turning point came when I missed a credit card payment for the first time in my adult life. Not because I didn't have the money, but because I had lost track of the due date amid all the therapy appointments and medical bills and treatment coordination that had consumed my mental bandwidth. The late fee and interest charges were small compared to what I was spending on David, but they represented something larger, the way his needs had completely displaced my own financial well-being and basic life management. That night I sat in my car outside Dr. Martinez's office, waiting to pick David up from his session, and tried to calculate how much longer I could sustain this arrangement. The math was brutal. At the current rate of expenses, I would be financially ruined within 6 months. My credit would be destroyed, my savings completely depleted, my ability to maintain my own housing compromised. But David emerged from therapy that evening more hopeful than I had seen him in months. Dr. Martinez had told him he was making significant progress, that she could see real changes in his thought patterns and coping mechanisms. He was excited about some new strategies they were working on, optimistic about his growing emotional stability. He thanked me repeatedly on the drive home for making his healing possible, for believing in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Listening to his enthusiasm, seeing the life returning to his eyes, I pushed my financial concerns aside. This was what I had invested in: David's recovery, his return to himself. The money was just money. His mental health was irreplaceable. The fact that he was improving proved that every dollar had been worth it. I told myself that his independence was just around the corner, that all this sacrifice would soon pay off in his successful return to work and life. I ignored the voice in my head pointing out that his timeline kept shifting, that his dependence seemed to be deepening rather than decreasing, that I was enabling a dynamic that might be hurting both of us. Instead, I focused on his gratitude, his progress, his genuine need for support during this difficult time. I told myself I was being a good friend, a good person, someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed or commodified. I told myself that my temporary financial stress was a small price to pay for someone's psychological wellness. I had no idea that I was already drowning, mistaking the weight of water for the satisfaction of purpose. No idea that David's recovery was becoming contingent on my destruction, that my sacrifice was no longer investment but pure loss. The slow drain had become a hemorrhage, but I was still calling it healing. 1 year into David's stay, I stood in the grocery store checkout line with my card declined, watching the cashier's sympathetic smile as she suggested I try another payment method. I had no other payment method. My checking account was overdrawn, my credit cards were maxed out, and the $23 in cash in my wallet wouldn't cover the $47 grocery bill. I left the cart there and walked out, my face burning with shame. This was my new reality. I had become someone who couldn't afford basic groceries while simultaneously funding another person's twice-weekly therapy sessions, monthly psychiatrist appointments, and an ever-expanding array of treatment modalities that Dr. Martinez deemed essential for David's continued progress. The most recent addition to his care team was a specialized trauma therapist who charged $200 per session for EMDR treatment. David had uncovered repressed childhood memories during his regular therapy, memories that Dr. Martinez believed were fundamental to understanding his current struggles. The trauma work was intensive, requiring weekly sessions that left David emotionally raw and needing additional support between appointments. I had become that additional support by default. David would emerge from trauma therapy sessions in a dissociative state that terrified both of us. He would sit on my couch for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally breaking into unexplained tears. Dr. Martinez had explained that this was normal for trauma processing, that he needed a safe, stable environment to integrate what he was uncovering. My presence, my apartment, My unwavering availability had become medical necessities in her treatment plan. The financial mathematics of David's healing were staggering. Regular therapy at $150 twice weekly, trauma therapy at $200 weekly, psychiatrist appointments at $300 monthly, medication costs that fluctuated between $200 and $400 per month depending on what combination Dr. Martinez was testing. Emergency therapy sessions when his anxiety spiked, charged at the same rate as regular appointments but with no advance planning to budget for them. Beyond the direct medical costs, David's daily life had become expensive in ways I hadn't anticipated. His anxiety made him unable to cook, so I was providing all his meals or paying for delivery when I was too exhausted to prepare food myself. His medication made him nauseated, requiring expensive organic foods and supplements that might ease his symptoms. His sleep disruption meant I was often awake with him during his worst nighttime anxiety spirals, leaving me too tired to function properly at work the next day. My job performance had deteriorated beyond the point where I could hide it behind excuses. Janet had given me a formal performance improvement plan after I missed a crucial client deadline because I had spent the day managing David's medication-induced panic attack. The plan was clear: improve within 60 days or face termination. But improving seemed impossible when David's needs continued to escalate rather than stabilize. The previous week, David had called me sobbing from Dr. Martinez's office, begging me to come pick him up because he was having a breakdown and couldn't navigate public transportation in his state. I left an important presentation to my company's biggest client, apologizing to colleagues and promising to reschedule. When I arrived at the therapy office, David was curled in a chair in the waiting room, rocking slightly and unable to make eye contact with anyone. Dr. Martinez took me aside to explain that David was processing significant trauma and would need intensive support for the next several weeks. She recommended I consider taking some time off work to be present during this critical phase of his treatment. The idea that I might not be available when he needed me could actually impede his progress and potentially cause a major setback in his recovery. I wanted to laugh at the suggestion of taking time off work. I was already drowning financially from funding David's treatment. Taking unpaid leave would make my situation impossible. But Dr. Martinez spoke with such clinical authority about the necessity of consistent support during trauma processing that disagreeing felt like abandoning someone during a medical emergency. The guilt manipulation had become more sophisticated as David's awareness of my sacrifice increased. He would apologize constantly for being such a burden, but these apologies always came with detailed explanations of why reducing his treatment wasn't possible right now. He was so close to a breakthrough. Dr. Martinez had said this was the most important phase of his healing. Disrupting his care now would undo months of progress and potentially leave him worse than when he started. He had started researching his conditions obsessively, forwarding me articles about treatment-resistant depression, complex trauma, the dangers of discontinuing therapy prematurely. He built compelling cases for why every expensive intervention was necessary, why my financial sacrifice was literally saving his life. He painted vivid pictures of what would happen if he couldn't afford proper care: suicide, hospitalization, permanent psychological damage. These weren't explicit threats, but they felt like threats nonetheless. The underlying message was clear: my financial ruin was unfortunate, but his psychological destruction would be catastrophic. My money problems were temporary and solvable, but his mental health issues were life-threatening and required immediate, ongoing intervention. I had started having my own anxiety attacks, triggered by opening bills or checking my bank balance. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was developing mental health symptoms from funding someone else's mental health treatment, but I couldn't afford therapy for myself. Every dollar was already allocated to David's care, and suggesting that I needed support too felt selfish when he was dealing with such severe trauma. My physical health was deteriorating as well. The stress of constant financial pressure combined with sleep deprivation from David's nighttime anxiety had left me exhausted and sick more often than I had ever been. I was losing weight because I often skipped meals to save money or because I was too busy managing David's crises to eat regularly. My hair was falling out in clumps from stress. I looked like someone in crisis, but David's needs continued to eclipse any attention to my own well-being. The few friends who were still speaking to me had begun expressing serious concern about the situation. My friend Rachel had offered to lend me money for groceries after I canceled our dinner plans for the third time because I couldn't afford to eat out. When I broke down and explained my financial situation, her response was immediate and blunt. I was being taken advantage of by someone who had learned to weaponize his mental health needs. But Rachel hadn't seen David during his worst moments. She hadn't witnessed the genuine terror in his eyes when his anxiety peaked, hadn't heard him sobbing about wanting to die, hadn't sat with him through the dissociative episodes that left him unable to recognize his own reflection. The David she imagined was a calculating manipulator. The David I lived with was someone in excruciating psychological pain who needed more help than any one person should have to provide. The breaking point should have been when I couldn't make my rent payment for the first time. I had to call my landlord and beg for an extension, explaining that I was dealing with a family emergency and would have the money within a week. It was humiliating, but I told myself it was temporary. David was making so much progress in therapy. Dr. Martinez had started talking about him potentially being ready for part-time work within a few months. All I had to do was hold on a little longer. But David's definition of being ready for work kept evolving. First, he needed to complete the trauma processing, which Dr. Martinez now estimated would take at least 6 more months. Then he would need time to integrate what he had learned and develop coping strategies for workplace stress. Then he would need to ease back into professional life gradually, probably starting with volunteer work to rebuild his confidence. Each extension of his timeline came with clinical justification from Dr. Martinez and heartfelt apologies from David. He felt terrible about how much I was sacrificing for his recovery. He would pay me back everything as soon as he was working again, with interest. He knew I was struggling financially, but rushing his healing process could result in a complete breakdown that would set both of us back even further. The manipulation was so expertly woven into legitimate therapeutic concepts that I couldn't distinguish between David's actual needs and his learned helplessness. When I suggested he might benefit from some job search activities to build confidence, Dr. Martinez agreed, but recommended he work with an employment counselor who specialized in mental health recovery. Another specialist, another hourly rate, another monthly expense added to the growing pile. When I mentioned that my own stress levels were becoming unmanageable, David became immediately solicitous and guilty. He researched low-cost therapy options for me, found sliding-scale practitioners who might be affordable, but we both knew I couldn't afford any therapy while funding his comprehensive treatment plan. The implicit message was that my mental health would have to wait until his was stable, that my needs were secondary to his survival. I had begun borrowing money from my retirement account to cover basic living expenses. The penalties were brutal, but I was out of other options. My credit cards were maxed out, my personal loan payments were consuming 20% of my income, and I had already sold everything of value I owned. I was liquidating my future to fund David's present, telling myself it was a temporary sacrifice that would pay off when he recovered and became self-sufficient. But David's recovery seemed to require increasingly expensive interventions with increasingly distant timelines for independence. Dr. Martinez had started suggesting that he might benefit from a residential treatment program to really focus on his healing without the distractions of daily life. The programs she recommended cost between $5,000 and $15,000 for 30-day stays, not including ongoing outpatient care afterward. When I couldn't hide my shock at these numbers, David immediately backpedaled. He didn't need residential treatment if I couldn't afford it. He would make do with his current care team, even though Dr. Martinez really thought intensive treatment would accelerate his progress significantly. He felt terrible about being such a financial burden, but he was scared of what would happen if his treatment wasn't adequate. The guilt was crushing. Here was someone who was genuinely suffering, who had made real progress with the treatment I was funding, who might benefit from more intensive care that I simply couldn't provide. I felt simultaneously manipulated and genuinely concerned for his well-being. The line between helping someone heal and enabling their dependency had become completely blurred. I started lying to everyone about my financial situation because the truth was too humiliating to admit. I was an educated professional woman who had voluntarily destroyed her financial stability to fund another adult's lifestyle and therapy bills. I had prioritized someone else's healing over my own basic needs and was now facing potential bankruptcy as a result. The most painful part was David's growing sense of entitlement to my sacrifice. He had stopped expressing surprise when I covered new expenses and started expecting them as part of his treatment plan. When his medication needed to be increased, requiring more expensive monitoring, he assumed I would handle the costs. When Dr. Martinez recommended adding a nutritionist to address his medication-related digestive issues, he researched practitioners and presented me with options as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. He had learned to frame every request in terms of medical necessity and my moral obligation to support his healing. Saying no to any expense meant potentially sabotaging months of progress and leaving someone vulnerable during their most fragile psychological state. I had become financially trapped by my own compassion, unable to set limits without feeling like I was abandoning someone who depended on me for survival. But I was the one who was actually drowning. I was the one whose health, career, and future were being systematically destroyed. I was the one who needed rescue from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond my control. The person I had tried to save had learned to swim by using my body as a flotation device, pushing me underwater in the process, and I was still calling it healing. 2 years into David's stay, I received an eviction notice. 30 days to pay the 3 months of back rent I owed or face removal from the apartment I had called home for 5 years. I stared at the legal document in my hands, trying to process how I had become someone who couldn't afford basic housing while simultaneously funding another person's increasingly elaborate mental health treatment regime. Eviction notice was the culmination of a financial free fall that had accelerated beyond my ability to manage or hide. My credit cards were maxed out at their highest limits. My personal loan payments consumed 40% of my take-home pay. I had borrowed the maximum allowed from my retirement account and was facing tax penalties that would devastate next year's finances. I was quite literally choosing between keeping a roof over my head and continuing to fund David's therapy appointments. When I showed David the eviction notice, his reaction was immediate and predictable. He was devastated that his needs had contributed to this crisis. He felt terrible about being such a burden. He would do anything to help, but he wasn't in a position to contribute financially right now, especially when he was in such a delicate phase of his trauma recovery. Dr. Martinez had warned that any major disruption to his support system could trigger a severe psychological setback. The clinical language had become David's primary defense mechanism. Every conversation about practical realities was filtered through therapeutic concepts that made reasonable requests seem dangerous to his mental health. When I suggested he might need to find somewhere else to stay while I figured out my housing situation, he reminded me that his attachment trauma made sudden changes in living arrangements particularly triggering. When I mentioned that he should probably look for any kind of work to start contributing financially, he explained that Dr. Martinez had specifically advised against employment stress during active trauma processing. I had started to recognize the pattern, but recognizing it didn't make it easier to resist. David had learned to use his psychological vulnerability as a shield against any expectations or boundaries. His mental health needs had become so all-consuming that addressing practical realities felt like threatening someone's recovery, potentially their life. The job search that had been ongoing for 2 years had become an elaborate performance of effort without results. David spent hours daily on employment websites, crafting applications and researching companies. He had interviews occasionally, but they never resulted in offers. The feedback was always that he seemed anxious, unfocused, not quite ready for the demands of full-time work. Dr. Martinez interpreted this as confirmation that he needed more intensive treatment before attempting to rejoin the workforce. But I had started paying closer attention to David's actual job search activities, and the reality was far different from his reports. The positions he applied for were either completely outside his skill set or so competitive that hundreds of qualified candidates were competing for single openings. He would spend entire days crafting the perfect application for one unrealistic job rather than applying for multiple achievable positions. When I suggested he consider temporary work or entry-level positions to rebuild his confidence and start earning income, he explained that underemployment could damage his self-esteem and trigger his depression. The circular logic was maddening. David couldn't work because his mental health was too fragile, but his mental health couldn't improve without expensive ongoing treatment, which required someone else to fund his life indefinitely. Any suggestion that he take incremental steps toward independence was reframed as potentially harmful to his psychological well-being. Meanwhile, my own psychological well-being had deteriorated to the point where I was barely functioning. I was having panic attacks in my car before work, knowing I would spend another day pretending to focus on clients while calculating whether I could afford lunch. I was lying awake every night running financial calculations that never added up to sustainability. I had started having suicidal thoughts, not because I wanted to die, but because I couldn't see any way out of the financial and emotional trap I had created. The irony was brutal. I was developing serious mental health symptoms from the stress of funding someone else's mental health treatment, but I couldn't afford therapy for myself. Every dollar was already allocated to David's comprehensive care team, and suggesting that I needed support too felt selfish when he was dealing with such severe trauma. My work performance had reached the point where termination was inevitable. Janet had been increasingly direct about my unavailability and distraction. I had missed another crucial deadline the previous week when David had a panic attack during his trauma therapy session and needed me to come immediately to Dr. Martinez's office. The client was furious, my colleagues were frustrated, and Janet had scheduled a meeting for Monday that I knew would be my final performance review. Losing my job would make my financial situation impossible, but I couldn't seem to prioritize work responsibilities over David's immediate psychological needs. When he called crying from therapy, when he texted that he was having suicidal thoughts, when Dr. Martinez recommended that I be present for particularly difficult sessions, I dropped everything. His mental health crises had become my emergencies, consuming my attention and energy at the expense of everything else in my life. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. I had just finished yet another conversation with my landlord, begging for more time to pay the back rent, when David approached me with a printed email from Dr. Martinez. She was recommending a specialized residential treatment program for complex trauma that would accelerate his healing significantly. The program was in California, lasted 6 weeks, and cost $18,000, not including travel expenses. David presented this information with the clinical detachment he had perfected over 2 years of discussing expensive treatment options. Dr. Martinez really thought this program could be transformative for his recovery. He knew the cost was significant, but the program had an exceptional success rate with patients who had similar trauma histories. He had researched payment plans and financing options that might make it more manageable. I stared at the email, trying to process the surreal disconnection between the numbers on the page and my current reality. $18,000. I was facing eviction because I couldn't afford $1,200 in back rent, and David was presenting me with information about an $18,000 treatment program as if it were a reasonable consideration. Something inside me snapped, not dramatically, not with shouting or tears, but with a quiet, cold clarity that felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't realized was surrounding me. I looked at David, sitting on the couch in my apartment that I was about to lose, wearing clothes I had bought him, after spending the day in therapy sessions I had funded, presenting me with information about an $18,000 program while I was facing homelessness. I told him no, simply, clearly, without explanation or justification. No, I could not and would not pay for residential treatment. No, I would not research financing options. No, this was not a reasonable request given my current financial situation. David's response was immediate shock, followed by the familiar clinical reframing. He understood that the cost was prohibitive, but maybe there were other options we hadn't explored. Maybe his family could contribute something, though they had been largely absent during his recovery. Maybe Dr. Martinez could recommend a less expensive alternative that would still address his trauma effectively. But underneath his reasonable tone, I could see something else. Surprise that I had said no without lengthy discussion. Confusion about why I wasn't immediately researching solutions to make his treatment possible. A subtle expectation that my refusal was an opening position in a negotiation rather than a final answer. I realized that David had become accustomed to my automatic yes. 2 years of saying yes to therapy appointments, yes to medication costs, yes to specialist consultations, yes to emergency sessions, yes to every expensive intervention that Dr. Martinez recommended. He had learned to expect my resources to be available for his needs without question or limit. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time, I laid out the full extent of my financial destruction clearly and without apology. The credit card debt, the retirement account withdrawals, the personal loans, the missed rent payments, the impending eviction. I explained that I had no more money to give, no more credit to access, no more assets to liquidate. I was financially ruined, and continuing to fund his treatment was impossible. David listened with growing distress, but his responses revealed how completely he had insulated himself from the reality of my sacrifice. He had assumed I was comfortably covering his expenses from surplus income rather than destroying my financial future. He had interpreted my willingness to pay as evidence that the costs weren't significant, rather than recognition of how thoroughly I had prioritized his needs over my own well-being. When I finished explaining my situation, David was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I had considered asking my family for help, whether my sister Emma might be willing to contribute to his treatment costs, whether I could take out additional loans or find other sources of funding to continue his care. The suggestion that I should involve my family in funding his treatment, that I should further destroy my financial future to maintain his current lifestyle, was so disconnected from reality that I finally understood the full scope of what had happened. David had learned to see me not as a person with my own needs and limitations, but as a resource to be optimized for his benefit. My financial ruin was unfortunate but secondary to his therapeutic progress. I told him he needed to move out, within 30 days, sooner if possible. I could no longer provide housing or financial support, and continuing the current arrangement would destroy us both. David needed to find somewhere else to stay and some way to fund his own treatment. His reaction was swift and manipulative in ways that would have worked on me 6 months earlier. He was devastated that I was abandoning him during such a vulnerable time in his recovery. Dr. Martinez had specifically warned about the dangers of disrupting his support system during trauma processing. He wasn't ready for independence yet, hadn't developed adequate coping mechanisms to handle the stress of self-sufficiency. But the clinical language that had once compelled my compliance now sounded hollow and self-serving. David had been in intensive therapy for 2 years with minimal progress toward actual independence. His coping mechanisms seemed robust enough when it came to manipulating my resources, but mysteriously inadequate when it came to basic life responsibilities. When manipulation didn't work, David shifted to bargaining. He would get a job immediately, any job, and start contributing to expenses. He would scale back his treatment to only the most essential appointments. He would do whatever it took to make the arrangement sustainable because he couldn't imagine rebuilding his life without my support. But it was too late for bargaining. The damage was already done, the pattern too established, the cost too high. I had learned that David's promises of future reciprocity were always conditional on maintaining his current level of comfort and support. Every timeline for independence had been extended, every plan for contribution had been postponed, every boundary had been negotiated away. I had spent 2 years believing I was helping someone heal, but I had actually been enabling someone to avoid the discomfort of healing. David had learned that psychological vulnerability could excuse unlimited consumption of other people's resources. He had built a lifestyle around being too fragile to function independently while being sophisticated enough to manipulate the system that supported him. The conversation ended with David crying, not the desperate tears of someone in psychological crisis, but the frustrated tears of someone whose primary resource had suddenly become unavailable. He wasn't crying about his mental health or his trauma or his fear of independence. He was crying because the person who had funded his lifestyle for 2 years was no longer willing to continue the arrangement. Watching him cry, I felt nothing. No guilt, no compassion, no urge to comfort or reassure him. Just cold clarity about what our relationship had actually become and how thoroughly I had been used by someone who had learned to weaponize his psychological needs. David moved out 2 weeks later, with minimal drama but maximum martyrdom. He found a friend who would let him stay temporarily, discovered suddenly that his family was willing to help with treatment costs, and managed to secure part-time work within days of my ultimatum. The ease with which he found alternatives once mine were no longer available was the final confirmation of everything I had begun to suspect. David hadn't been unable to support himself. He had been unwilling to support himself as long as someone else was available to do it for him. I had spent 2 years drowning to keep someone afloat who had always known how to swim. He had just preferred the comfort of being carried. The silence in my apartment after David moved out was deafening. For 2 years, my life had revolved around his schedule, his needs, his crises. Now, with no therapy appointments to drive him to, no medication pickups to coordinate, no emotional meltdowns to manage, I was left alone with the wreckage of my financial life and no clear understanding of who I was without the constant demand of being someone's savior. David's departure had been swift and vindictive in ways that revealed the calculating mind beneath his therapeutic vulnerability. Within 24 hours of my ultimatum, he had secured temporary housing with a college friend I had never heard him mention. Within a week, he had found part-time work through a connection that had apparently been available all along. Within 2 weeks, he had established a payment plan with Dr. Martinez that reduced his sessions to weekly rather than bi-weekly, proving that scaling back his treatment had always been possible. The speed and efficiency of his independence was staggering compared to the 2 years of learned helplessness I had witnessed and enabled. David hadn't been incapable of managing his own life. He had been unwilling to manage it as long as someone else was available to handle the logistics and absorb the costs. But his newfound self-sufficiency came with a campaign of character assassination that caught me completely off guard. David had immediately framed his departure as abandonment, my boundary setting as betrayal, my financial ruin as evidence of my conditional love. Within days of moving out, he was telling mutual friends that I had kicked him out during the most vulnerable phase of his recovery, that I had used his dependency against him, that I had proven to be just another person who gave up on him when supporting him became inconvenient. The narrative he constructed was masterful in its manipulation of sympathetic listeners. He acknowledged that I had helped him initially, but painted my support as calculating rather than generous. According to David's version of events, I had trapped him in dependency by insisting on paying for everything, then used his reliance on my financial support as leverage to control his recovery process. When he had finally started making progress and developing independence, I had sabotaged his healing by withdrawing support out of jealousy and need for control. The rewriting of our history was so thorough and convincing that several mutual friends reached out to express disappointment in my behavior. They had heard that I had been supporting David through a difficult time, which was admirable, but they were disturbed to learn that I had abandoned him so abruptly when he was still fragile. Some suggested that I had never truly understood the complexity of mental health recovery, that my expectations for his improvement had been unrealistic and potentially harmful. These conversations were devastating because they contained just enough truth to seem credible. I had been supporting David financially. I had set boundaries around that support. I had asked him to move out when continuing the arrangement became unsustainable. David's version simply reframed my generosity as manipulation, my sacrifice as control, my necessary boundaries as abandonment. The most painful part was how effectively David had isolated me from potential support by preemptively controlling the narrative. By positioning himself as the victim of my conditional love, he made it impossible for me to discuss my own experience without seeming to attack someone vulnerable. Any attempt to explain the reality of our financial arrangement looked like blaming him for needing help. Any description of his manipulation seemed like retaliation against someone who had simply required more support than I was able to provide. My family's reaction was complicated by their own guilt about not intervening sooner. Emma had been warning me about the unsustainable nature of my arrangement with David for months, but she had also felt unable to force me to see what I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Now that the relationship had ended badly, she was torn between vindication and regret that she hadn't pushed harder for me to set boundaries earlier. My parents were confused by the entire situation and my attempts to explain it. They had met David only briefly during his stay, and he had been charming and grateful during those interactions. From their perspective, I had offered to help someone in crisis, then changed my mind when the help became expensive. They couldn't understand why I had continued funding his treatment for so long if I couldn't afford it, or why I had suddenly decided to stop if his need was genuine. The questions everyone asked revealed how thoroughly I had failed to communicate the reality of what was happening even to people who cared about me. I had been so focused on protecting David's privacy and maintaining the narrative that I was simply helping a friend that I had never adequately explained the scope of his dependency or the extent of my sacrifice. Now, trying to explain it after the fact looked like revisionist history designed to justify my abandonment of someone vulnerable. The financial consequences of my 2 years with David were catastrophic and would take years to resolve. I had accumulated over $30,000 in credit card debt, withdrawn $15,000 from my retirement account with penalties, and taken out 2 personal loans totaling $20,000. My credit score had dropped over 200 points due to missed payments and high utilization rates. I was facing bankruptcy as the only realistic option for managing debt that exceeded my annual income. The eviction notice I had received became a reality when I couldn't come up with the back rent even after David moved out. I had to find a much cheaper apartment in a less safe neighborhood, downgrading from the comfortable home I had built for myself to a studio apartment that felt like starting over from nothing. The moving costs and security deposits further strained my already impossible budget. My job situation had become untenable as well. Janet had finally terminated my employment after a pattern of absences and poor performance that I couldn't adequately explain without revealing the extent to which David's needs had consumed my professional attention. I was eligible for unemployment benefits, but they covered less than half my previous salary and wouldn't last long enough for me to fully recover financially. Finding new employment was complicated by the gaps in my recent work history and the poor reference from my previous position. I had to take a job that paid significantly less than my previous role, extending the timeline for financial recovery even further. The stress of job searching while managing overwhelming debt created a cycle of anxiety and depression that I couldn't afford to treat professionally. The irony of developing mental health symptoms from the financial stress of funding someone else's mental health treatment wasn't lost on me, but it was also irrelevant to my practical situation. I needed every available dollar for basic survival and debt payments. Therapy was a luxury I couldn't afford, just as it had always been for David, until I made it available to him through my own financial destruction. The most difficult aspect of recovery was learning to trust my own judgment again after 2 years of having my perceptions consistently challenged and reframed. David had been so skilled at presenting reasonable explanations for unreasonable requests, at making my legitimate concerns seem petty or unsupportive, that I had lost confidence in my ability to distinguish between manipulation and genuine need. Every interaction with other people became an exercise in hypervigilance as I watched for signs of similar patterns. Was this person expressing genuine appreciation or practicing manipulation? Was this request for help reasonable or the beginning of exploitation? Was my hesitation to assist someone evidence of healthy boundaries or trauma-induced selfishness? The few friends who had remained supportive throughout my relationship with David tried to help me process what had happened, but their perspectives were limited by what they had witnessed from the outside. They had seen me become increasingly stressed and isolated, but they hadn't experienced the daily erosion of boundaries that made each step toward total financial sacrifice seem logical and necessary. Rachel, who had offered to help with groceries during my worst financial period, was angry on my behalf in ways that felt both validating and overwhelming. She wanted me to expose David's behavior to mutual friends, to correct the narrative he was spreading, to hold him accountable for the financial abuse she believed he had perpetrated. But engaging in that kind of public conflict felt exhausting and potentially counterproductive. David had already positioned himself as the victim in our relationship. Any attempt to challenge that narrative would likely be interpreted as further evidence of my allegedly controlling and manipulative behavior. He had the advantage of sympathy and the protection that comes with being perceived as vulnerable, while I had the disadvantage of being seen as the person with resources who had chosen to withdraw support. 6 months after David moved out, I learned through mutual friends that he was thriving in ways that made my 2 years of sacrifice seem both unnecessary and completely forgotten. He had transitioned from part-time to full-time work within 3 months of leaving my apartment. He had moved into his own place and was managing his finances independently. He had scaled back his therapy to monthly sessions and had discontinued the expensive specialist treatments that I had funded. Most painfully, he had started dating someone new, a woman who knew nothing about our history except that I had been a controlling friend who had tried to sabotage his recovery by making his support conditional on meeting my expectations. David had apparently told her that he had learned important lessons about accepting help from people with ulterior motives, that he was grateful to have finally escaped that toxic dynamic. The ease with which David had reconstructed his life without me proved everything I had suspected but been afraid to acknowledge. He hadn't needed the intensive, expensive treatment regimen that I had funded. He hadn't been too fragile to work or manage basic life responsibilities. He hadn't required the constant emotional support and crisis management that had consumed my life for 2 years. David had simply learned that expressing psychological vulnerability could provide access to unlimited resources without reciprocal obligations. He had discovered that framing reasonable expectations as threats to mental health could neutralize attempts at boundary setting. He had mastered the art of using therapeutic language to justify exploitation while maintaining the moral high ground of being someone in need. The person I had sacrificed everything to help had never actually needed saving. He had needed someone willing to be consumed by his needs while he rebuilt his life at their expense. Once that person was no longer available, he had simply found the resources and capabilities that had been there all along. I had spent 2 years funding not David's recovery, but his vacation from personal responsibility. Every therapy session I paid for had been an hour he didn't have to spend earning money to support himself. Every crisis I managed had been a problem he didn't have to solve independently. Every boundary I failed to enforce had been permission for him to take more while giving nothing back. The realization that my sacrifice had been not just unappreciated but actively harmful to both of us was devastating. I hadn't helped David heal. I had enabled him to avoid healing by removing all consequences for his choices. I hadn't saved someone's life. I had taught someone that other people's lives were expendable in service of their comfort. But understanding the manipulation didn't undo its effects. I was still financially ruined, professionally damaged, and emotionally traumatized by 2 years of systematic exploitation disguised as mental health support. David was still thriving in his new life, protected by a narrative that painted him as a survivor and me as an abuser. The aftermath of setting boundaries had been more destructive than the boundary violations themselves, but it had also been necessary, even if it came too late to prevent the worst of the damage. I was finally free from funding someone else's lifestyle, even if freedom meant starting over from less than nothing. That had to be worth something, even if I couldn't calculate its value yet. 3 years later, I was standing in line at a coffee shop when I overheard David's voice from a corner table. He was having what appeared to be a virtual therapy session, earbuds in, speaking in the measured tones I remembered from his sessions with Dr. Martinez. What I heard made my hands shake so violently I had to set down my wallet. He was describing our entire relationship to his new therapist as a cautionary tale about accepting help from people with ulterior motives. According to his narrative, I had been someone who happened to be around during a difficult period in his life, someone who had inserted herself into his recovery process and tried to make herself indispensable. He spoke about learning to recognize when people use generosity as a form of control, when supposed friends try to create dependency to feed their own need to be needed. The clinical language was familiar, but the content was unrecognizable. David described me as someone who had pushed expensive treatments on him that he hadn't needed, who had discouraged his independence efforts, who had used financial support as leverage to maintain control over his life choices. When he had finally developed enough self-awareness to recognize the toxic dynamic, he had courageously extracted himself from the situation despite my attempts to guilt him into staying. I stood frozen, listening to my own history being rewritten by someone who had consumed 2 years of my life and every dollar of my savings. The person who had begged me for help, who had cried with relief when I offered to pay for his therapy, who had presented me with increasingly expensive treatment options as medical necessities, was now describing me as a manipulative controller who had forced unwanted help on him. But what devastated me most was how thoroughly David seemed to believe his revised version of events. This wasn't strategic lying for therapeutic effect. This was genuine conviction that I had been the problem in our relationship. He had reconstructed our history so completely that he now inhabited a reality where my sacrifice had been exploitation, my boundaries had been abandonment, and his manipulation had been self-preservation. The 3 years since David moved out had been the hardest of my life, while apparently being the most successful of his. I had filed for bankruptcy 18 months earlier after exhausting every other option for managing the debt I had accumulated during his stay. The process had been humiliating and expensive, requiring legal fees I could barely afford and credit counseling sessions that felt like public acknowledgement of my complete financial failure. My living situation had stabilized at a level far below where I had been before David entered my life. The studio apartment I had moved to after the eviction was in a neighborhood where car break-ins were routine and the heat worked sporadically. I had learned to live without amenities I had once taken for granted: reliable internet, adequate parking, a kitchen with full-size appliances. The apartment was clean and safe enough, but it felt like a constant reminder of how far I had fallen. My career recovery had been slower and more difficult than I had anticipated. The gap in my employment history and the poor reference from my previous position had made finding comparable work nearly impossible. I had taken a series of contract positions that paid less and offered no benefits, slowly rebuilding my professional reputation while struggling to cover basic living expenses. The new job I had finally secured was with a smaller company at a salary 20% lower than what I had been earning before David's crisis consumed my professional life. My colleagues were younger and less experienced, making me feel like I was starting over in ways that highlighted how much ground I had lost during those 2 years of prioritizing someone else's needs over my own career development. My credit score was slowly improving from the post-bankruptcy baseline, but I was still years away from being able to qualify for decent housing or reasonable interest rates on necessary purchases. The financial impact of my relationship with David would follow me for at least another 5 years, affecting everything from apartment applications to insurance premiums to employment background checks. The emotional recovery had been even more complex and ongoing. I had developed trust issues that affected every relationship, romantic and platonic. I found myself analyzing every interaction for signs of manipulation, every request for help for evidence of exploitation. I had become hypervigilant about reciprocity to the point where casual friendships felt exhausting to navigate. Dating had been particularly difficult because I couldn't shake the fear that any vulnerability I showed would be weaponized against me. When potential partners shared their problems or struggles, I would immediately start calculating the potential cost of becoming involved with their emotional needs. When they expressed appreciation for my support, I would wonder if they were identifying me as someone who could be useful rather than someone they genuinely cared about. The few serious relationships I had attempted since David had ended because of my inability to trust that the other person's interest in me was separate from what I could provide for them. I had become someone who viewed generosity as dangerous and emotional availability as a liability. The person who had once prided herself on being supportive and nurturing had learned to see those qualities as exploitable weaknesses. My family relationships had also been strained by the aftermath of my experience with David. Emma felt guilty about not intervening more forcefully when she could see the situation was destroying me, but she also remained frustrated that I had ignored her warnings for so long. Our conversations often carried an undertone of mutual recrimination, her regret at not pushing harder, my resentment that she hadn't somehow saved me from myself. My parents struggled to understand how their financially responsible, professionally successful daughter had ended up bankrupt from supporting someone who had ultimately painted her as the villain in his story. Their attempts to be supportive often felt like judgment, their practical advice about financial management coming years too late to be useful and sounding like criticism of choices I had made with the best of intentions. The social consequences had been longer lasting than I had expected. David's narrative about our relationship had become the accepted version among several mutual friends who had never heard my perspective in detail. I had lost those friendships not through dramatic confrontations, but through gradual exclusion from group activities and invitations. It was easier for everyone to maintain relationships with David, who appeared to be thriving and moving forward, than with me, who represented an awkward reminder of a complicated situation. The isolation had been profound during the worst financial period, when I couldn't afford to participate in most social activities anyway. By the time my situation had stabilized enough to rebuild friendships, many of the relationships had atrophied beyond repair. I had learned that being financially vulnerable made people uncomfortable in ways that extended beyond their ability to help. It made them question their own security and reminded them how quickly life circumstances could change. But hearing David's voice in that coffee shop, describing me as someone convenient who had happened to be around when he needed help, was a level of historical revision that took my breath away. The word convenient suggested that my presence during his crisis had been coincidental rather than chosen, that my support had been casual rather than life-altering, that my sacrifice had been insignificant rather than devastating. I had given David 3 years of my life, every dollar of my savings, my physical and mental health, my career momentum, my relationships, my housing security, my financial future. I had prioritized his healing over my own basic needs, funded his comprehensive treatment while denying myself any support, managed his emotional crises while developing my own anxiety and depression from the stress of keeping us both afloat financially. And in his current narrative, I had been convenient, someone who had happened to be around, a casual participant in his recovery story rather than the person who had made his recovery possible through complete self-sacrifice. The clinical detachment with which he discussed our relationship was particularly painful because it mirrored the therapeutic language he had used to justify his increasing demands while we lived together. David had learned to frame every aspect of his life in psychological terms that made questioning his needs seem cruel and supporting them seem like moral obligation. Now he was using the same language to erase my role in his recovery while painting me as someone who had exploited his vulnerability. But what struck me most was how successful David appeared to be in his current life. He looked healthy, well-dressed, confident in ways that contradicted everything I had been told about his fragility and need for intensive support. The person who had been too psychologically fragile to work part-time was now clearly functioning at a high level professionally. The person who had needed twice-weekly therapy sessions to manage basic daily life was now having routine check-ins with a new therapist who seemed to be hearing about me for the first time. David had not only recovered from the crisis that had brought him to my door, he had thrived in ways that made his previous dysfunction seem like a choice rather than a condition. The extensive, expensive treatment regimen I had funded appeared to have been unnecessary for his actual recovery. The person I had sacrificed everything to save had never actually needed saving. After listening to as much of his session as I could bear, I left the coffee shop without ordering anything. I sat in my car in the parking lot, trying to process the disconnect between the David I had lived with and the David I had just overheard. The person who had sobbed about being unfixable was now discussing his recovery as a triumph of self-advocacy and boundary setting. The person who had presented every treatment recommendation as medically necessary was now describing his previous care as excessive and unnecessary. Most painfully, the person who had promised to repay every dollar I had spent on his recovery was now describing that financial support as inappropriate boundary crossing rather than generous friendship. David had apparently told his new therapist that he had learned to recognize when people use money to create obligation and control, when supposed generosity was actually manipulation designed to keep someone dependent. I drove home to my small apartment, my reduced life, my ongoing financial struggle, while David continued his session in the comfortable coffee shop I could no longer afford to frequent regularly. The contrast was stark and bitter, his obvious prosperity versus my continuing consequences from the same relationship that had left him thriving and me ruined. That evening I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked up David on social media. His profiles showed a life of professional success, social connection, and financial stability that made my sacrifice seem both completely unnecessary and entirely forgotten. He had been promoted twice in the past year at a job that appeared to value his contributions highly. He He had traveled internationally, moved to a luxury apartment, bought a new car. Most importantly, he had posted several articles about toxic relationships and financial abuse, positioning himself as someone who had learned to recognize and escape manipulation. The posts received dozens of supportive comments from friends who praised his wisdom and strength in overcoming difficult relationships. David had become an advocate for people who were being taken advantage of by controllers and manipulators. The irony was devastating. The person who had systematically exploited my resources while using therapeutic language to prevent any boundaries or expectations was now publicly positioning himself as an expert on recognizing and escaping exploitation. The person who had weaponized his mental health needs to justify unlimited consumption of my time, energy, and money was now warning others about people who used generosity to create control. David had not only erased my sacrifice from his recovery story, he had transformed me into the cautionary tale, the villain other people needed to watch out for. My generosity had become his evidence of manipulation. My financial support had become his example of toxic control. My boundary setting had become his proof of abandonment by people with ulterior motives. 3 years later, David was successful, stable, and surrounded by people who saw him as someone who had overcome adversity through his own strength and wisdom. I was financially ruined, professionally diminished, emotionally damaged, and socially isolated as a direct result of the same relationship. And according to his current narrative, I had been just someone convenient who happened to be around when he needed help. The person I had destroyed my life to save didn't just refuse to acknowledge my sacrifice. He had rewritten history to make that sacrifice disappear entirely, replacing it with a story where I was the one who had taken advantage of him. That was perhaps the cruelest cut of all, not just being forgotten, but being remembered as the enemy. I still have the bank statements from those 2 years, not because I enjoy torturing myself, but because sometimes I need proof that it actually happened. That I actually spent $43,000 of my own money keeping someone afloat who now tells people I was just convenient, someone who happened to be around when he needed help. The numbers don't lie, even when memory becomes unreliable under the weight of someone else's revisionist history. Therapy sessions, medication costs, rent I covered when he couldn't contribute, groceries I bought when his anxiety made him unable to shop, emergency room visits when his panic attacks felt life-threatening. Each transaction recorded with clinical precision, a financial autopsy of a relationship that nearly killed me. 4 years have passed since David moved out, 4 years of rebuilding from the financial wreckage, of learning to trust my own perceptions again, of understanding how someone can use their trauma as a weapon against the people trying to help them heal. The bankruptcy is behind me now, the credit slowly recovering, the career trajectory finally pointing upward again. But the real damage wasn't financial. The real damage was learning that some people will consume everything you offer and then rewrite history to make your sacrifice disappear. That generosity can be weaponized against you by someone skilled enough to use therapeutic language as camouflage for exploitation. That the person you save might need to cast you as the villain in their story to justify how thoroughly they used you. I've learned to recognize the signs now, the way certain people position themselves as perpetual victims while somehow always landing on their feet, the clinical language used to deflect any accountability or reciprocal obligation, the shifting timelines for independence that mysteriously extend whenever actual self-sufficiency becomes a possibility, the reframing of reasonable boundaries as abandonment, of legitimate concerns as control. David taught me that trauma can become a prison, but not always for the person who experienced it. Sometimes trauma becomes a key that unlocks other people's resources indefinitely. The person who has been hurt becomes untouchable, beyond criticism or expectation, while everyone around them sacrifices their own well-being to avoid causing additional pain to someone who has already suffered. I understand now why David needed to erase me from his recovery narrative. Acknowledging my role would have meant acknowledging that his success was built on someone else's destruction. It would have meant recognizing that his healing had come at the cost of my financial, professional, and emotional well-being. It would have meant admitting that he had learned to exploit compassion rather than overcome adversity. Much easier to remember me as convenient, much simpler to recall our relationship as one where I had tried to control him rather than one where he had systematically drained every resource I possessed. Much more comfortable to position himself as someone who had escaped manipulation rather than someone who had perfected it. The most insidious part of what David did was how he used the language of healing to justify consumption. Every expensive treatment became essential for his recovery. Every boundary I tried to set became dangerous to his progress. Every moment I prioritized my own needs became evidence of my conditional love. He wrapped exploitation in therapeutic concepts until I couldn't distinguish between supporting someone's healing and enabling their entitlement. I see him occasionally around the city, always from a distance. He looks prosperous, confident, untroubled by any memory of the person who made his current success possible. I feel nothing when I see him now, no anger, no sadness, no urge to approach him or correct the record, just a kind of hollow recognition, like spotting a landmark from a trip you wish you'd never taken. People sometimes ask if I regret helping him. The question misses the point entirely. I don't regret helping someone in crisis. I regret not understanding the difference between helping someone heal and becoming their endless resource. I regret confusing compassion with self-destruction, mistaking sacrifice for love, believing that my financial ruin was the price of his psychological wellness. What I regret most is how long it took me to understand that David's recovery required my destruction, not because healing is inherently expensive, but because David had learned that expressing vulnerability could generate unlimited support without reciprocal obligation. His progress was measured not by increasing independence, but by increasing sophistication in accessing other people's resources. The hardest lesson has been accepting that some people cannot be saved because they don't want to be saved. They want to be supported, enabled, carried indefinitely by others who mistake their own depletion for proof of their love. David didn't need healing. He needed someone willing to be consumed by his needs while he rebuilt his life at their expense. I've started dating again carefully. I've rebuilt friendships cautiously. I've learned to help others selectively. The experience with David didn't make me cruel or selfish, but it made me conscious of the difference between supporting someone and sacrificing myself for someone who has learned to equate love with unlimited availability. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had set boundaries earlier, said no sooner, recognized the manipulation before it destroyed my life. But those what-ifs are pointless now. The David who moved in with me wasn't someone who could have been fixed with better boundaries. He was someone who had learned to identify and exploit people like me, generous, empathetic, willing to believe that love should cost everything. The person I tried to save didn't need saving. He needed someone to consume while he figured out how to thrive without them. Once he had extracted everything useful from our relationship, discarding me became part of his recovery story. My destruction wasn't a side effect of his healing, it was the foundation it was built on. But I survived, financially ruined, professionally damaged, emotionally scarred, but alive and finally free from funding someone else's lifestyle while they learned to paint me as their oppressor. Some bridges are meant to be burned, some are designed to collapse once they've served their purpose. I was David's bridge back to a successful life, and like any bridge, I was never meant to be permanent, just functional until he reached the other side. The tragedy isn't that he used me. The tragedy is how completely he convinced me that being used was the same thing as being loved.